This is lesson 19.7, French Revolution, Race and Gender. How did the events of 1789 result in a constitutional monarchy in France, and what were the consequences? And we're really focusing on the consequences here because we're past the year 1789 for the most part. College Board topic 5.4 is the one we're still in, French Revolution. Explain the causes, events, and consequences of the French Revolution. And we want to stay with this one. Women enthusiastically participated in the early phases of the revolution. However, while there were brief improvements in the legal status of women, citizenship in the Republic was soon restricted to men. And we also have the French Revolution's effects. Explain how the developments of the French Revolution influenced political and social ideas from 1648 to 1815. And we have College Board topic 5.5, the French Revolution's effects. And we're going to explore the background of this one here. Revolutionary ideals inspired a slave revolt led by Toussaint Louverture in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which became the independent nation of Haiti in 1804. Now that's going to get its own lesson, but today we are going to talk about the background that led up to this revolt. And also, while many were inspired by the revolution's emphasis on equality and human rights, others condemned its violence and disregard for traditional authority. And when we're talking about traditional authority, we're basically talking about things that people were used to in their old way of life. Things like dues and fees and feudalism and nobility. Places, France and the colony of Saint-Domingue. And our time frame is 1789 all the way to 1793. And I always want to put this in here for these lessons on the French Revolution. I've used many different sources for these lessons on the French Revolution, but I want to give a special recognition to the great courses Living the Revolution and the Age of Napoleon by Professor Suzanne Desan. And you can listen to this book from audible.com. It's well worth it. The French Revolution and racial inequality. And we've talked about France's colonial empire, but you can't talk about the abolition of privilege and hierarchy without talking about institutionalized racism and racial inequality. How much more relevant can the French Revolution be than that? At a time in America when this lesson is being created, there's a huge awakening going on in white America about systemic racism in our country. There's a deeper understanding of the Black Lives Matter movement, and that all lives matter response has really fallen out of our discourse because we've seen it for what it really is, some kind of unconscious attempt, really, to obscure and blunt the Black Lives Matter message. The whole world saw George Floyd tortured to death in broad daylight in public by a sadist with a badge, and we saw that Derek Chauvin had absolutely no fear of the witnesses and all the cameras that were recording everything he was doing. And it lends credence to the observation made by the French person I talked about previously who said that in America, the government does not fear the people. As we know, the George Floyd case is only one of a very long list of similar cases. And one of the patterns that I notice is that a lot of these authorities don't seem to care that their actions are recorded on camera. Cameras in the hands of witnesses don't seem to change their behavior. They might even make behavior worse. I know white people who still remain willfully in the dark and willfully unsympathetic to the racial inequality in our country, but I also know more white people who are accepting responsibility for educating themselves about these issues. They're reading books, they're hearing podcasts, they're watching documentaries, they're talking to people, and they are consciously developing a level of awareness and empathy that they didn't have before. And hopefully that's a permanent change that will impact generations. Racial inequality is a major part of the French Revolution's story. In the fall of 1789, two guys showed up from the French colony of Saint-Domingue to petition the National Assembly to end certain racist laws. As we know, Saint-Domingue was the crown jewel of the entire French colonial system. Its sugar and coffee and indigo brought huge amounts of wealth to France, As we know, lots of people were petitioning the National Assembly about all kinds of things, and these two men were named Julien Raimond and Vincent Ogé, and they were both rich. In fact, Julien Raimond owned 100 slaves. And Julien Raimond and Vincent Ogé had to hire a local lawyer to present their petition to the National Assembly for them. They weren't allowed to address the National Assembly on their own behalf. Why? Each of them had one African grandparent, and that made them free people of color. The National Assembly heard their case from their white lawyer and passed their petition to the Colonial Committee. Like our own United States Congress, the National Assembly was organized into specialized committees, and these committees reviewed issues and wrote drafts of bills and recommended legislative action to the National Assembly as a whole. What exactly was in Julien Raimond and Vincent Ogé's petition to the National Assembly? It was these: that free people of color should have full citizenship, and that free people of color should have full political representation. Notice that their petition did not ask for the abolition of slavery. And most importantly, they petitioned that the future Constitution, with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen as its starting point, should be applied to the French colonies and not just France itself. The Colonial Committee had a lot to consider in this petition. Would the French Revolution grant full rights to all people of color in the French colonies? Would the French Revolution abolish the slave trade? Would the French Revolution abolish slavery altogether? And if all these other institutions were so assailable, like, for example, the monarchy and the church and feudalism, etc., why not go after the institution of slavery also? What might the consequences of all of this be for France? The Society of the Friends of Blacks. Back in 1788, even before the Revolution, a society had been formed in France with two goals. It was called the Society of the Friends of Blacks, and one goal was to first abolish the slave trade, and the other goal was to next abolish slavery. It was a small club, but it was very active, though not very successful. It supported the French Revolution when it came along. It had many prominent members, including a few members of the National Assembly. Gabriel de Comte Mirabeau from Lesson 1904, and our hero Lafayette, Washington's protege. The grievance lists that we talked about in Lesson 1904 that elected deputies had taken with them to the Estates General had a few complaints about racism. There were about 500 total lists from all over France. Almost 50 of these contained complaints about the slave trade. Jacques Necker, the French finance minister, also condemned the slave trade in his opening day address of the Estates General from Lesson 1904. The Society of the Friends of Blacks had even developed a plan for abolishing slavery gradually and methodically over a period of 7 years. But even with all of this momentum, the Society of the Friends of Blacks faced great opposition to its ideas in the National Assembly. Why? If you read, and we've talked about this book before, if you read Ibram X. Kendi's book, Stamped from the Beginning, he makes the case that racism comes from racist ideas. This goes directly against the idea that we all have some natural, innate tendency towards racism that we struggle with all our lives. Think about this. If none of us were walking around with racist ideas in our heads, there would be no racism. Racism wouldn't exist. And this continues a discussion about racist ideas that we began back in Lesson 14.5. Ibram X. Kendi emphasizes that anybody can be racist. You can even be racist against yourself, and we saw that in the story of Leo Africanus. So where do we get our racist ideas? Ibram X. Kendi argues in his book that if you want to know where racist ideas originate and spread from, follow the money. Find out who is benefiting materially at the expense of another race of people, and you will find the sources and the peddlers of racist ideas. Those who profit financially from the oppression of another group are eager to find, generate, believe, and propagate racist ideas that legitimize what they do and what they think. And these ideas can persist for centuries, especially if they are in print. Let's apply Kendi's ideas to 18th century France. As we know, Saint-Domingue and the other sugar islands were bringing huge amounts of wealth into France. Many of our revolutionary deputies in the National Assembly were from some of France's wealthiest port cities, and they were not very eager to disrupt the flow of wealth into their own cities. Many argued that this wealth represented the economic future of France itself. As many as 150 deputies in the National Assembly even owned property in the colonies, and their personal fortunes were directly tied to slavery. White colonists and rich port merchants had even formed a powerful lobby, the Club Massiac, to defend slavery at all costs by whatever means necessary in the National Assembly and in popular opinion. Racist ideas were of great assistance to all of these people and their efforts to keep the wealth coming in. Quick story about the Club Massiac's power in Paris, which also connects us to some of the other elements of the French Revolution. In December 1789, a new play opened in Paris, and it was called The Slavery of Blacks or The Lucky Shipwreck. And it was written by a woman named Olympe de Gouges, who we will meet later. In the play, a white French couple was shipwrecked and rescued by a runaway slave named Zamore, who had accidentally killed a colonial official who was abusing his wife. And the French woman in this couple, her dad turned out to be the local colonial governor, and he got her dad to set Zamore free, so it was a happy ending. But even more controversial than the story was one single line that Zamore said in the play, and it was this: "Why do the Europeans have such an advantage over us poor slaves? We are humans as they are. Why is there such a difference between their race and ours?" These were incendiary words in 1789. And the powerful Club Massiac was determined to get that play shut down. They published death threats to the playwright Olympe de Gouges. They called on their supporters to boo the play in the theater. The mayor of Paris expressed fear that the play would cause an uprising. On opening night, abolitionists and hecklers from the Club Massiac argued with each other so loudly that you couldn't hear the play. The conservative press trashed the play, and the play had to be shut down after just 3 days. And it all shows just how heated the issue of slavery was in revolutionary France. Slavery and the wealth it created could even be considered a matter of national security for France. We learned in Lesson 17.5 that Britain dominated the slave trade in the 18th century. And we already know that Britain and France were bitter adversaries. And the argument went like this: who would like more than anyone for France to lose its slave labor supply? Great Britain. Our decline in wealth and power would be Britain's gain. There was also the very real concern that the white planters of Saint-Domingue might break away from France and even join up with Britain rather than give up their slaves. And if that happened, all their sugar would become Britain's sugar, and that would be an all-out catastrophe. White planters of Saint-Domingue also got organized very quickly when the Estates General had been called by King Louis XVI in 1789. They had sent 17 delegates uninvited to the Estates General, and they brought grievance lists of their own for the Estates General to read, just like all of France had. Most importantly, they had prevented any free people of color from participating, and all of this caused a very big stir in Paris. And it forced a public debate as to how the colonies should be represented in the Estates General, which we know was very short-lived and almost immediately replaced by the National Assembly. How many deputies should the colonies get in the Estates General? In Saint-Domingue, there were 30,000 white people, about 25,000 free people of color, and about 500,000 African slaves. The white planters argued that the slaves should count as population and add to the amount of representatives Saint-Domingue should get. Does this sound familiar? How did our U.S. Constitution infamously handle this exact question in our own country? Mirabeau, as we know, a member of the Society of the Friends of Blacks, had even argued that if slaves were men, then they should be freed and they should be given seats in the Estates General. As we know, the National Assembly was formed very soon after the Estates General started meeting, and that's in less than 1904. The National Assembly worked out a compromise for the colonies. The colonies would get 17 deputies to represent them in the National Assembly. 6 of those deputies would come from Saint-Domingue. As we know, France had colonies on multiple continents. But what about free people of color like Julien Raimond and Vincent Ogé? There were about 25,000 free people of color on Saint-Domingue. As I said before, that's almost as many as there were whites. Some of those were of pure African descent. Most were of mixed African and European descent. And we discussed this development in detail in Lesson 17.5 and a previous lesson. Some had been slaves who had bought their own freedom. Some were the children of white planters and enslaved mothers who had been freed by their fathers. Many mixed-race families had a history going all the way back to the 1600s. Some free people of color had a lot of wealth and power. Free people of color owned a third of the plantations and a quarter of the slaves on Saint-Domingue. Most were not rich at all. Before the 7 Years' War, free people of color had very few restrictions on the island. There were very few legal distinctions between whites and free people of color on the books. But in the 7 Years' War that lasted from 1756 to 1763, as we well know, France lost the colony of Quebec in New France, and that changed many things. White settlers who were seeking their fortunes in the colonies came to Saint-Domingue in greater numbers. Quebec was closed to French settlers. It was in the interests of these settlers to block free people of color from competing with them for business opportunities, political opportunities, social status, etc. And these white settlers also resented the wealth and the power that they saw in free people of color. White settlers' racist ideas were also supported by all of these allegedly scientific theories about racial difference coming out of the Enlightenment at the time that we learned about. And the economic demand for sugar, coffee, indigo, etc. was rising steadily. New slaves were constantly being brought in from Africa. The number of slaves rose to 500,000 in Saint-Domingue. And it seemed like drawing tight lines of racial difference would be a good way to maintain order against the real fear of a slave revolt. Our hero, Mirabeau, once remarked to a bunch of white planters from Saint-Domingue, "You sleep at the foot of Vesuvius." So a huge collision was coming to these colonies, like two huge trains heading towards each other. You had these revolutionary ideas about equal rights, and you had these colonial traditions of racial hierarchy. How do you appeal to a powerful pro-slave lobby like the Club Massiac on behalf of free people of color and equal rights? Our two free people of color, Julien Raimond and Vincent Ogé, did not want to end slavery. The Society of Friends of Blacks was also not making any progress towards ending slavery. The opposition was just too powerful. So instead, Raimond and Ogé argued that free people of color could actually help prevent a slave revolt as allies of the white planters. So the big question for the deputies in the National Assembly was simple and complicated at the same time. Did the new ideas expressed in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen and in the new French Constitution apply to the French colonies? So the Colonial Committee studied the question as legislative committees do. They were led by Antoine Barnave. Not one single abolitionist or defender of free people of color was on the Colonial Committee. They considered the economic impact of imposing the new constitution on the colonies. Disturbing the economic practices of the colonies could give Britain an economic edge. And they also feared that the white planters would themselves revolt and break away from France if the National Assembly imposed the Constitution on them. In the end, the Colonial Committee chickened out. They let economic concerns and political concerns be more important than their revolutionary ideals. They recommended that the Constitution, with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen at the front of it, not be applied to the French colonies. The committee's leader, Antoine Barnave, said, "The difference in places, mores, climates, and products seems to us to require different laws." So the National Assembly exempted the colonies from the Constitution. They also let the colonies handle their own local elections. And as a result, local assemblies all over Saint-Domingue deliberately blocked all free people of color from participation as citizens. Julien Raimond stayed in Paris and continued to work for the rights of free people of color. Vincent Ogé went back to Saint-Domingue, and he lobbied unsuccessfully for the rights of free people of color. And then he organized a militia of free people of color. There were no slaves in the militia, and he got into a skirmish with French royal troops. And in early 1791, Ogé was captured and hanged in the main square of Saint-Domingue's capital. People in France were so shocked by Vincent Ogé's treatment that concern over the rights of free people of color increased, and the press kept the issue alive. The lobby in favor of free people of color grew in the National Assembly. Later, in 1791, the National Assembly compromised. Free people of color would have full citizenship if they were born of two free parents. But the leaders of Saint-Domingue flat refused to comply with this new decree. But in August of 1791, none of that mattered anymore. In August of 1791, 500,000 slaves of Saint-Domingue revolted against their captors. It was the largest slave revolt in the history of the world. It was the only slave revolt in history that succeeded. It convinced the National Assembly to abolish slavery completely in all colonies. France eventually lost its most profitable colony, and it's a story that's so important that it gets its own lesson later on. The French Revolution and gender inequality. There's a documentary made of the book, The Notorious RBG, and if you look at it, it's surprising how many sexist laws were still on our books in the United States as late as 1970. We have had gender inequality in our world ever since man learned how to farm. And the French Revolution played a huge role in the fight for women's equality. In the old regime of France, women had not been a political category like they are today. Many women were very active, but they didn't get to express themselves through voting. In the 1790s, the notion of women having a political voice suddenly came up. Why? There was a rights ideology that forced people to ask the kinds of questions that we've already been asking. Who counts as a citizen? What does universal rights actually mean? In revolutionary France, there was female political participation everywhere you looked. The press, political clubs, riots, petitioning the National Assembly, demonstrating, festivals, even participation in households. French revolutionary women were in print more than ever. There was no more censorship, and the consumption of books and newspapers and pamphlets had skyrocketed, and the number of women in print skyrocketed. And they wrote about practically everything, especially about politics, women's issues, rights, education, prostitution, poverty, marriage, divorce, family, inheritance. French revolutionary women were also taking to the streets, as we have seen. Women were marchers and demonstrators and rioters. The storming of the Bastille and the October days with the Women's March on Versailles had changed the course of the revolution. They had brought the king, queen, and the National Assembly to Paris permanently. French men tended to recognize that women had the right to speak on certain issues, especially religion, especially food, and these were not trivial, marginalized topics. These were vital and central topics to French culture and even French survival. In 1792, when France went to war with Austria, that's where we'll be going next, women petitioned the National Assembly for the right to bear arms. The right to bear arms was actually new for men. And women felt that they also had the natural right to defend themselves. And they even listed their weapons of choice: pikes, pistols, and sabers, muskets if they were strong enough. Apparently muskets give off quite a kick. Women formed lots of political clubs in over 60 towns in France. Some of these clubs were auxiliaries to the men's clubs. And women learned how to run political clubs as the revolution progressed. There were reactions to women's political clubs. Many men resented women's participation in political clubs. They claimed that it took time away from women to keep their households in order. But some men encouraged women's political clubs. Some argued that women's support for the revolution in and of itself had earned them greater rights. So what did women's political clubs do? They offered help working local elections. They ran charities and workshops. They made uniforms for soldiers. They made bandages for the war. They organized send-offs for departing soldiers. They planted and decorated and maintained liberty trees, and liberty trees were all the rage everywhere in France. 60,000 towns and villages had liberty trees by 1792. They rallied support for oath-taking constitutional priests. Women gave lots of speeches in the clubs and even on the streets. Women's activism in political clubs raised the question of full political citizenship in France. In the 18th century, women weren't thought of as full individuals. They were thought of as dependent family members. They were under the authority of husbands or fathers or brothers. As I said before, some argued that women's support for the revolution in and of itself had earned them greater rights, and these arguments were built on revolutionary ideology about natural rights, etc. One big advocate of women's rights was Nicolas de Condorcet. If you study Condorcet, you get an idea of the kinds of arguments both sides were making on the issue of women's rights. Condorcet was a liberal noble. He was a member of the Society of the Friends of Blacks, and he became a deputy in the National Assembly in 1791. In 1790, Condorcet wrote a pamphlet called On the Admission to Women of the Right of Citizenship. And one counter-argument that Condorcet addressed was the notion that women have different physiological and emotional characteristics from men. This was a common view in the 18th century, and it was held by both men and women. Men were thought of as more rational, women were thought of as more moral. And some believed that a pregnant woman was in no condition to vote. Condorcet argued that you wouldn't deny the right to vote to a man who got gout every winter or who caught colds too easily. Condorcet agreed that women didn't reason the same way that men did. But he argued that women did reason, and he argued that women could be as analytical as men. Condorcet was himself a mathematician. Condorcet agreed that women were not ready to be informed voters, but he didn't blame the women for this. He believed that it was because women were denied an equal education. We've seen that theme come up again and again, haven't we? Ever since Christine de Pizan. He argued that inequality of education was one of the main sources of tyranny. And finally, Condorcet argued that women could have political rights and still have time to be good mothers. As a deputy in the National Assembly, Condorcet was made the head of the Educational Committee, and he spearheaded secular, state-run education for the first time in France. He planned for both boys and girls to get the exact same education. Another advocate of women's rights was Olympe de Gouges. Olympe de Gouges is kind of a poster child for the standard French Revolution curriculum. Teachers always had to teach about Olympe de Gouges. We typically teach two things about her: that she wrote the now famous pamphlet Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen, and that she was executed during the Reign of Terror in 1793. And teachers often put these two things together and teach, incorrectly, that she was executed by a bunch of men for writing Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen. In fact, Olympe de Gouges actually wrote like crazy on many topics, including many plays and a few novellas. And she wrote that play that we talked about called The Slavery of Blacks, or The Lucky Shipwreck, which had caused such a stir in 1789. Olympe de Gouges always wrote from the position that women deserved more equality, more freedom of expression, and more political representation. She wrote against slavery. She wrote for divorce rights. She wrote for the establishment of a national women's theater. She wrote for regulating prostitution and for having a luxury tax to help the poor, etc. She wrote extensively about equality in marriage, in which women would have communal property rights and equal legal powers. In Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen, Olympe de Gouges took the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen and substituted woman for man. She followed the Declaration of the Rights of Man point by point in her argument for the rights of women. And she used Jean-Jacques Rousseau's general will idea to argue that women should become political leaders. If women could be executed under the law, they should help make the law. And this was considered an outrageous assertion. Even Condorcet didn't go that far. Even Mary Wollstonecraft didn't go that far in her Vindication of the Rights of Woman from 1792. None of that was why Olympe de Gouges was executed late in 1793. She was actually accused of being a royalist, a supporter of the king. Being a royalist could get you executed very quickly and easily in 1793, as we will find out. She had actually dedicated Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen to Marie Antoinette, who didn't bother to write her back. And when Louis XVI went to trial for treason, spoiler alert, he goes to trial for treason, Olympe de Gouges publicly offered to lead his defense. He didn't take her up on it, but she offered. She had become highly critical of the revolutionary government at that point. And she wrote a poster, actually, called The Three Urns, in which she suggested that the French people should vote on what type of government they wanted. A constitutional monarchy was one of her choices. Bad choice. It had become punishable by death to encourage a constitutional monarchy at that point. Authorities also discovered an unfinished play that she had written in which a fictional version of herself was giving Marie Antoinette advice on how to be a better queen. And the poster and the play were both used to make the case that Olympe de Gouges didn't support the revolution, even though she claimed she did. She was also accused of being associated with a political party called the Girondins. All of the Girondins were being purged from existence at that time, and these are things that we're going to talk about soon. Olympe de Gouges was denied her right to a lawyer. The judge actually reasoned that since she wrote so much about the law, she could defend herself. Neither Olympe de Gouges nor Nicolas Condorcet survived the coming reign of terror that lasted from 1793 to 1794. Olympe de Gouges was guillotined on November the 3rd, 1793, and Nicolas Condorcet was also associated with the Girondins and was arrested, and he was found dead in his prison cell on March 31st, 1794. In the meantime, still back in 1790, 1791, the National Assembly gave unprecedented civil rights to women. There were new family laws. Sisters got equal inheritance rights with their brothers. Women got the right to choose their own husbands. Women could initiate a divorce if they were in an unhappy marriage. Both boys and girls could go to primary and secondary school. Students could have both male and female teachers. And the feminist movement of the coming 19th century would be built upon the arguments of the French Revolution.